she was going to try to, oh, thank you, Mary. She was going to try to join us, and I hope she will. She wasn't sure. Oh, there I am in the spotlight. She wasn't sure if she was going to be able to connect, so we made plans to just in case we made plans. But I hope she does join us, because she is the MC, the creator of this series, and the brains behind it all. But tonight, so I'm Judy Berman. I'm the executive director of Capitol Hill Village, the proud sponsor of Trudy Peterson's work at Village Voices. And I am very pleased to welcome you tonight to our Village Voices presentation by Mai Pham. I get to count Mai as a friend of mine. Our kids went to school together. They started in like pre-K 4, I think. So we're neighbors, so we've kind of watched each other's families grow up. I always knew Mai as a doctor and an artist. She does amazing paintings and sculptures. And then I discovered that Mai was also this amazing chef. And when I say amazing, I mean like, we're talking like Great British Bake Off kind of amazing, you know, baker and cook. And then among the professional things, she did start a new nonprofit to help the medical system better serve people with adults and young adults with developmental disabilities and autism. So she is an amazing person. Oh, and then the memoir, of course, right? That wasn't, so there's, she's one of these people that you wonder, is there anything she can't do? So I'm very pleased to share her with the Village community tonight, and I know we'll have a great conversation. So Mai, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Judy, for those sweet words. And I see Carolyn in the mix from Charles. So great to see, and Liz Gregg, other folks that I know. And this is such a treat for me because Capitol Hill, where we moved 20 years ago, has really been my first, I think, neighborhood where I felt really safe. And where if I had to choose a pick where I had roots, I would choose this place, even though I didn't come to Washington until I was in my 30s. And I think it was this neighborhood and the community here that made it possible for me to evolve and heal to the point where I could actually produce this memoir. So this is just me giving back. And so what I thought I would do, I didn't time myself tonight. So what I would really appreciate is if you all would signal when you want to stop for conversation. I'm more than happy to do that. I don't have to finish all the readings that I had tagged. Just wanted to give you a flavor of the journey that I've been on, and some of the more universal points of human existence that I feel like I've had to uncover, and would open it up for discussion, especially in this time of holiday and family. It's just so evocative. So with that, let me just start with the basics. That I was born in the south of Saigon from northern parents. So my parents were very typical of a certain generation of Vietnamese who fled the North in 1954 at the demarcation between North and South. And they had not met each other yet. They were teenagers when they went south. And they met in Saigon, where there was a quote unquote expat community of Northerners, many of them late teenagers who were several years behind in their schooling because of all the disruptions from war. And they actually met each other in an after hours English class. So that's how the family started. And we fled Saigon roughly 10 days before the city fell in 1975. And we landed relatively quickly, just about a month later, in Philadelphia. And I'm happy to share details about that, but it was a happenstance because my father had studied in the States on a scholarship in the 60s, and his roommate at the time was a young law student at Penn who then sponsored us when we were ready to get out.
Mm.
But I thought what I would start with is this early chapter where I write in chapterlets, so they're itty bitty pieces, where I talk about our last day. So it's called Day, Night, Week, Month. My therapist told me most people experience a singular life stream, a narrative that may skid forwards and backwards, but he used a one line with a connecting middle, beginning, middle, and end. So even if images from a few hours, days, or months fade, there aren't skeins of film shaved off the top and bottom, discarded and coiling on the floor. For most people, it's one long story where I had only scattered frames in a roughly appropriate sequence, but with missing lengths of context. So this is what I kept of my last day in Vietnam. I come back to our house at midday from school to eat, lunch, and nap. In the early afternoon, I run out front at the high-pitched trill of my father's Vespa, but he doesn't cut the engine or dismount. Instead, my mother gets on her motorcycle and they both ride off, turning in different directions at the end of the block. Our housekeeper brushes me back inside. By late afternoon, both parents return. They tell us to change back into street clothes. Someone drives us in suitcases in our car to a waiting bus. Nearly all my mother's siblings are there with their children and my grandmother, but not my father's relatives. The bus lurches through rush hour traffic toward the airfield. On the city's edge, brakes hiss and it comes to a slow stop. A soldier is just outside. I feel adults on the bus immediately tense their backs and relax muscles in their faces. The soldier waves us through and the bus jolts and accelerates again. Many families are at the airport. We sleep overnight in tents. And in the morning, we climb into the hull of an olive-colored cargo plane, small bodies and luggage filling the belly of a mother shark. I don't know what flag it has painted on it. I'm the only one standing, the others making a lumpy carpet about me. I'm bewildered by the sudden severing from our home life, the vast unknowing of what was to come, the lack of explanation from the adults around me. A man wheels away the steel staircase as the hatch begins closing. I feel my grandmother gently tugging me to the floor, folding her arm around my waist. The engine's hum vibrates across my skull as the orange of Saigon's dawn slowly narrows from the vertically oblong rectangle of the doorway to a horizontal rectangle, to a slit, and then blink to black. And I fall asleep. So within a couple of days, well, within one sleep cycle, we were in the Philippines and Guam, and then we flew to Fort Chaffee, and from there to Philadelphia. So it was about as clean an escape as you could imagine, but it didn't come with any explanation. There was one day I had this life, and the next day I had a different life. And you know, the experience of that itself was significant trauma, right? It's a major life change. I'm a small child, but there were many more such changes to come. And the first portion of the book is really about what it is to be an alien. I was the first Asian child to ever enroll in my public school. My siblings, my two older brothers, got a scholarship to a private school, so they were no longer in my day life. And my baby brother was a preschool, he was 3 years old, he was a toddler. So it was me and a lot of very dark children and very light children. And no one explained to me what was happening. And my first 2 weeks in school, I just cried until a teacher picked me up and calmed me down. And that was my introduction to first grade. And over the summer, my father and my brothers made it their job to make sure that I was prepared for second grade. So I learned English without an accent in the summer of 1975. And that's, you know, that's kind of how a child, albeit a gifted child, how a child just adapts, because there are no benchmarks. You don't know what is normal. You don't know what is too much for the adults to ask of you. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know when you are living in that inter existence between two languages. You don't know how to express your emotions or to whom to do it. And so there was a lot of that flying blind. And looking back on it now through many years of therapy, I figured out that that additional trauma contributed to something that happened. There was a moment in time when I was 8 years old that I started to fracture in my mind. And I, at the time, thought of it as a happy thing because I created an invisible friend. His name was Michael. He was just a little bit older than me, and he was perfect in every way. And Michael came with a whole world of people who loved me and took care of me. So it was a very adaptive way to respond to trauma. And it didn't become maladaptive until middle age, when I had a nervous breakdown. Judy says, "Oh, what can't Mai do?" The breakdown was actually triggered by very sudden professional success. And I was one of those women walking around with imposter syndrome who couldn't reconcile the external success with what I believed to be all of my personal deficits. And I just, it was actually in this house downstairs that I had my first roaring panic attack. And that is what triggered the therapy, which triggered the recognition of this. But I wanted to just share a little bit about what my inner life looked like when my mind started to fracture, and share with you a little part of the portrait of Michael, right? So here, let me just get to that section. Unlike a neighborhood playmate, Michael didn't appear fully formed. He evolved from space flyers, characters like superheroes I had imagined in the dark of my bedroom. His story and the world he lived in emerged over many years, refined while I lay in bed or rode in the station wagon during family vacations or sat in classrooms. Rarely he might appear in an actual night dream. Occasionally, a new detail about my friend would be so striking I could record where I was and what was happening in external reality when it happened. But more often than not, I experienced overlapping waves of new awareness, not singular incidents. I wrote down this version of Michael's story when I met my therapist. By then, my mental editing had stopped because he and his history had reached their underlying truth. Earlier versions of him are barely visible now, like under layers of paint on a finished canvas. So we learned that Michael was born of a Jewish mother, take note of that, and an Eastern European father who had a little bit of Asia in his eyes. But his parents died when he was 9. When Michael was 9, his parents dropped him off one morning for piano lessons at his teacher's house, and then went off arm in arm for a stroll. When they hadn't returned several hours later, his piano teacher called the house. The housekeeper came to bring him home. At nightfall, she called his grandparents, and together they alerted the police. Officers came and took notes, but made no promises, and the housekeeper helped Michael into bed. On the second day, the housekeeper walked Michael to school. When he came home, the police had returned, and so it had his grandparents. They found his parents' bodies floating in the river, not far from one another, with no sign of trauma. The bun of his mother's hair was still intact. On the 5th day, Michael counted hats in church at the memorial service and walked with his grandmother in the funeral procession. On the 7th day, he arrived on the front stoop of his uncle's townhouse. He had with him 2 valises, a box of school books, and his father's clarinet. Inside the case, wrapped in the scrap of leather his father used to clean the instrument, still supple and fragrant from linseed oil, was his mother's wedding ring. So that was the narrative, the origin story that I walked around with to justify to my 8-year-old self how Michael could be strong enough to recover from that. I built for him a world of people who saved him after that tremendous loss. And I would use that to nourish myself in the many dark hours that I didn't realize were dark because I didn't understand what was happening to me as a child. So then we skip ahead to other sources of trauma and depression. It was, as you imagine, a really stressful growing up for my parents. They had 4 kids. They had to restart from ground zero. They had had very successful careers and lives in Saigon, and they had to rebuild that in a world where their talents were not as celebrated as they had. And so they each responded in very different ways. And the way that my mother responded was, to be extremely anxious and verbally abusive. And because I was the only daughter in the family, I was often the only one in the room with her, in the kitchen, or going food shopping or doing laundry. And so I kind of caught the brunt of that. But she was what you would call a good enough mother. And she gave us many things that to this day nourish us metaphorically and literally. And so to celebrate that in the season, I wanted to read you part of this chapter. It's called Cook. I have to find it first. Here we go. The labial word mea is Vietnamese for mother, first formed by lips pressing softly together around a nipple or just before crying for help. It is the sound of a child enveloping a morsel and gently sweeping it down to where it will nourish. I watched the endless hours that my firstborn Benjamin hung onto my breast with his purse sucking, creating a second dimple in his cheek, his one exposed eye staring unblinkingly up to keep me in sight, and his thighs and knees folded into my belly, shuddering contentedly under my stroking fingertips. When he sat in his high chair and took his first spoonful of butternut squash mush, I marveled at how, up until that moment, every cell but one in his body had come from me. My mother didn't nurse her children, having proudly been able to afford the fancy foreign-made baby formula my father bought at the commissary on the US Army base. But as soon as we moved to solid food, she ruled everything that fed us. Our housekeeper in Saigon was sous chef, going to market and doing prep, but it was Mea who picked the menus and applied the heat and judged when the seasoning was right. Rice and stir fry, clear broth soups, and pungent meats punctuated our days at lunch and dinner. On holidays, symmetrically arranged plates of sticky red soy rice, fragrant with coconut milk, roast chicken, lemongrass, pork skewers, and shredded papaya salad covered the long dining table. I learned when to plunge with chopsticks for choice pieces of squid in the hot pot, just as they were finishing blanching. And on Sunday mornings, she spooned sweetened condensed milk into my short cup of dense café, or coffee, and showed me how to swirl the concoction from black brown to the olay color of her skin, and then twist off a crispy, chewy hunk of warm baguette to dunk in it. In America, once in our own row house, she turned the Formica galley kitchen into a laboratory, skeptically but gamely co-opting 70s staples like minute steaks and instant pudding into her own inventions. She gradually incorporated spaghetti and meatballs, her interpretations of sloppy Joe and steak frite, into a steady dinner rotation, along with her core repertoire of rice meals. To this day, any of her children will exit a highway at 10 o'clock in the morning for fried chicken. Good or bad, it doesn't matter. We are forever chasing the memory of her weighty drumsticks seasoned with nothing but salt and pepper and fried in light batter, just at the point where the moist muscle groups come apart in the mouth on their own. My mother was a fierce hunter-gatherer. She brought me grocery shopping to push the cart and pull boxed goods off the shelf. She sniffed produce, tissed, and frowned disapproval on underripe fruit, and outsmarted anybody daring to offer a discount. In South Philly, she didn't even bother being polite to the Italian street vendors, demanding that they reach in to trade out individual crabs she considered lethargic before she would pay for the bushel. They learned to fear her. For years, she would sit in the car on her way to work along Schuylkill River Drive, clucking her tongue at the waist of all those Canada geese freely congregating along the banks. Who would miss one, she'd say. We did briefly have a white duck waddling and quacking in the basement one weekend, but it mysteriously disappeared just before my parents hosted friends to dinner. My mother could make a meal from the most barren landscape. On vacation at the Maryland shore, I sat under an umbrella and grew bored watching her wade in ankle-deep seawater. When she emerged an hour or so later, she carried a pail full of inch-wide snails dug out of the tidal pool floor with her feet. Back in her condo, she steamed them and gave us each a safety pin from where I don't know to spike and gently twist the meat out of its shell to douse with salt and peppered lemon juice. Food was a weapon and a shield. It both fed and alleviated her litany of anxieties. It crept into conversation many days before a party. As time drew near, she would itemize out loud bargains she had found, her timetable for cooking, and her reasons for doing it this way or that. She keenly observed and kept tight memory of her eaters' likes and dislikes, so she could choreograph elaborate efficiencies like when to scoop out vegetables from a simmering broth because of my brother's aversion to onions, or how much of precious braised oxtails to set aside for me to snack on without skipping on the portions for bowls of pho for the rest of the family. When American guests arrived, she arbitrarily interrupted conversation to explain the menu or ask what they thought of an appetizer. She judges her grandchildren by what she offers that they dare to refuse to eat. When I arrive late to a family gathering, she pounces with a plate full of everything and tense instructions about what to eat first, second, and third. Her conversation perseverates on the contents of a meal until she has chewed its fibers to a pulp. On weekends, while we slept late, she woke at dawn and began checking on marinated meat or yellow peas that soaked overnight. She chopped vegetables and ground pork for spring rolls. I eventually came downstairs and sat in front of giant mixing bowls of flavored meat, obediently reaching for moistened sheets of rice paper she had spread on towels and rolling, then sealing spring rolls. Frying revealed which rolls were mine and not hers because mine would sloppily unfurl in the bubbling liquid. I learned how to execute the second half of many Vietnamese dishes. Her children are now all adventurous gourmands, driven by the imperative to not waste eating on food that is not at its best. We all live in our kitchens and collect restaurant experiences. One went so far as to marry a chef. When my sons were small, once a week, Bo and Matt picked them up from school and brought them back to our house. My father played with the kids, but in her nervousness, my mother cleaned my house, did our laundry, and glared at the boys until they bathed. She handed them each a pouch of contraband treats, juice boxes, Pringles, Girl Scout cookies, apple slices, curated to the right balance of crunchy salt, sweet, and something to wash it down. She was often gone by the time I arrived, having just skirted the periphery of my weekly life. On the counter, she left Tupperware full of fresh fried rice, stewed stuffed tomatoes, eggy noodles with fat shrimp and wilted onions, cut fruit, and broccoli steamed al dente to see us through to the weekend, relieving just enough stress for me to enjoy cooking then. So the other really important pivot points in the memoir are in my mid-20s, in the middle of my medical training, when a very dear friend died. And I marked that as the end of my childhood. And it triggered something very visceral and not intellectual. I understood within 3 months of him dying that I was going to go back to Vietnam. And I could not have explained to you why. And my husband had to just kind of get with the program and find a way to go with me. And it was an incredibly eventful year. We took a couple of scouting trips and then we lived there for an academic year. I was the first person in my immediate family to go back. And because my father had been the only son of the first wife of the village chief, he was the village chief in absentia, and I was his representative. And so you can imagine me with my grade school Vietnamese, these expectations, and then a medical project that I had to somehow execute on with my communist partners. It was an incredibly stressful time. So I'm just checking the time. I don't want to talk for very long. I really want to have this be a conversation. So I want to just read you a little bit from, well, which would you rather hear about? A little bit about my my ancestor story, which is colorful, or a little bit about what it was like to be a foreign Vietnamese back in Vietnam. 2. I see a vote for 2. Okay.
I want to hear both.
I'll tell you a little bit about, I'll do a little bit of both then. That's fair. Let me find it. So this bit is about my maternal grandfather. Sorry. And by the way, my parents were not happy that I decided to go back. Just to be clear, they absolutely panicked. They were convinced that I would be arrested and they'd never see me again. Hang on 1 second. I'm gonna do number 2 first. Okay. This chapterlet is called Mirror Door Whore, which just about says it all. Vietnamese who live in country refer to those in the diaspora as Viet Kieu, sojourners, those that wander. The label conjures ghosts, free-floating and aimless, robbed of destination and forever yearning. The living hold them guardedly at a distance, viewing them with a mix of pity at something disowned and envy of the freedom that wanderers enjoy. I was one of those ghosts, living in the soft middle land of a certain cohort of first-generation immigrant, too young to have rooted loyalties in the homeland, too old to forget it, comfortable enough in both places, but uncertain where to settle. I sensed accusations from other locals in Saigon, foreigners, sometimes my own relatives, about aspects of my half status, a fascination and skepticism about how much of my otherness was involuntary versus subterfuge. A Canadian expat friend often reminded me, please move around wherever we're going to meet so I can find you. When you stand perfectly still, I can't tell you apart from the locals. But when you move around, you look like a member of the People's Committee. I carried my shoulders broadly, walked with long, unladylike strides, and seemed taller than I actually was. When I was in a hurry and flagged down a Saigon, a motorbike, Manhattan taxi style on my tiptoes with my legs spread apart and a commanding wave of my hand, only the more daring drivers with new, larger motorbikes came. But when I stood still and instead demurely signaled with just a tilt of my head, I could fool anybody. When I wandered into a linen store to look for embroidered tablecloths my mother had asked for, the clerk patiently laid out samples and explained the Chinese scenery and symbols on each. Then she sized me up. She checked that no one else in the store was listening and asked me where I was from. I live in America, I said, and that was enough for her to begin confiding secrets. She had tried to flee the country, paying smugglers hundreds of dollars for a boat ride to the Philippines, only to see police boarding the vessel as she approached it. She was ready to try again. She would bring food and papers this time, one change of clothes, and money in her shoes to avoid drawing attention. This time, the boat would leave downriver outside town. The trip might take a week, and once in Manila, she would contact relatives in Australia to sponsor her. She wanted my opinion. Wasn't it a good plan? I froze in the moment, taken aback by her belief that a chance connection with me would confer luck and safe passage to a better life, and my own unwillingness to scuttle the fantasy that I was her live talisman because hope was so precious. I tried not to draw attention to my muddy accent. I adopted a mild Southern drawl that surfaced when speaking to shopkeepers and hotel clerks. But when I spoke to doctors at the medical school or clinic, my clipped Northern accent kicked in instead. If anyone detected the fraud, they were too polite to say. My vocabulary expanded exponentially as language lessons stretched on. Newly familiar words leapt off store signs and newspaper headlines, but it was still easier to read signs than try to catch all the guttural syllables that hawkers squawked at market. I made purchases by pointing to what I wanted and signaled numbers with my hands. If the seller gave me more of a vegetable than I needed, I just took it. And then there's this last part. In February, when I recognized signs of my early pregnancy, the Australian radiologist at my clinic insisted on performing a free ultrasound. She showed me the tiny sac with its throbbing blob of life. Inspired by the printout she gave me, I went to an upscale custom clothing shop and had them embroider the front of a mommy-sized and a baby-sized t-shirt, each with San Suet tại Vietnam, which means made in Vietnam. In early spring, out of clothes that fit, I passed over tourist shops and instead opted for cheap, locally made tent dresses that were easier than skirts and pants. Now, when I walked with my husband, David, there was more staring than usual from people we passed, some cold, some warm, depending on whether they thought I was cheap or smart to be carrying his child. My condition didn't seem to deter any of the women, from teenagers to middle-aged, who wanted to flirt with him. In the late 1990s, many Vietnamese women assumed most white men were gateways to a better life. But David was particularly easy on the eyes, and something about his slow smile, open expression, and earnest attempts at speaking Vietnamese made him seem approachable and desirable. The Vietnamese for Jewish, which he is, literally means intelligent and clever, and they had no trouble typing him as such. What was not to like? They discounted the ring on my finger or didn't notice it at all. Why wouldn't they compete with my near whore status? And then my maternal grandfather, and maybe in conversation we can talk about really how the first time that I learned about it, which is a story in and of itself, the way that my grandmother revealed it to me. I didn't first hear about 22. And then we tried to do research when we were in Vietnam. So no piece of family history was as vaporous as the mystery surrounding my maternal grandfather, Ông Ngoại. I learned to let my understanding of him hover in a cloud a little above the ground, not settled in any one place. He was born in 1908 of 5 children of a low-ranking bureaucrat in the colonial government. Because they lived in a city rather than the countryside, he had the rare experience of finishing 10 years of primary schooling. In the social and political turmoil of the 20s, many of his teachers effused a withering distaste for both French colonial practices and Confucian traditions. They exposed him to new ideologies, questioning Vietnam's passivity toward French oppression. This generation of petit bourgeois student activists dared call for aggressive opposition and to dream of independence. They would not wait for history to come to them. My grandfather's path began with joining local nationalist groups alongside his older brother. He earned revolutionary bona fides when the French imprisoned them both in 1931 in a widespread campaign of repression. Those prisons, especially Son La, where my grandfather did hard labor, and Con Long, where his brother was jailed, were prime recruiting grounds for the fledgling socialist movement. International communist bodies helped funnel material and moral support to prisoners while indoctrinating them in Marxism through whispers and shards of literature. Among the new recruits was a young man named John Huy Liu, who would become one of Ho Chi Minh's most trusted political advisors and the Vietnamese Communist Party's master propagandist, and later devote segments of his autobiography to how my grandfather sheltered him and helped him find work after they were released from prison. My grandfather, his brother, and John Huy Liu were among writers and newspaper publishers prodigiously active in the 1930s. Ông Ngoại started a paper called Renewal in 1935 that lasted a few months. More followed, including The Worker, including that involved him, John Huy Liu, and other future party luminaries like Vo Nguyen Giap, the military titan of the revolution. The band of brothers convened at a small concession stand that my grandfather's sister ran at the Metropole Hotel and became close-knit. Although the 3 men were all listed in French records of the time as troublemakers, the numerous broadsheets they produced flourished because of a paradox of relatively permissive French oversight that lasted just a few years. The leftist Front Populaire briefly ruled France during this time and were sympathetic to anti-colonialists, while colonial authorities in Vietnam were also eager to promote the use of Western script by the natives. In this heady political context and without birth control, my grandfather's family expanded to 7 children. It was clear from the beginning how different my grandparents were. Both devoted to their children, but my grandfather splurged on gifts, made up games to play, and rarely raised his voice, while my grandmother meted out discipline and ran a tight household, sometimes favoring some children more over others. He wafted between jobs while she squirreled away money for emergencies. Their friends and relatives thought him too much the idealist, his feet not quite on the ground, but that was what she loved about him. She let him soar and clung on for the ride, providing the ballast. To compensate for his meager earnings, she made parcels of food to sell at roadside, mended clothes for wealthier families, and opened a one-room schoolhouse. Trujillo sent his son to study there. She listened keenly. She learned to keenly watch unwise habits. She guessed money was going in part to drugs, a prison habit the French encouraged. He even took his younger son to an opium den once, curling up with the boy until his spell was over. He tried to quit the habit many times, but became so violently ill in withdrawal that my grandmother resigned herself to it. Over time, his relationship to the party grew complicated. He was in and out of trouble with colonial authorities, but was also able to intervene with the French on behalf of friends and got official approval to publish his brother's prison letters. Theories thus abounded of him being a spy or courier, whom the local party eventually suspected of being a double agent. We encountered a dead zone in our research from 1939 until 1947, when Ông Ngoại died, a period when Ho Chi Minh reasserted leadership over the communist movement, and Ông Ngoại friends rose to more prominent positions on the front lines of battle, while he remained in Hanoi in murky activity. According to my uncle, Trujillo invited my grandfather to join him in 1945 on a delegation to witness the abdication of Vietnam's last emperor. Maybe Ông Ngoại played both sides to make more money to feed his rapidly growing brood. Maybe he was vulnerable to French manipulation because of his opium habit. The truth is likely buried with all the other secrets of that generation of comrades, because Ông Ngoại purposely told my grandmother little about his political work in an effort to keep his family safe. What a different chapter will tell you is that one night, amid a whole wave of purges, party purges, that was driven by Von Winsap, local party officials came and arrested him and took him away. My grandmother tried to protest, and he told her to throw away all the guns because they promised him that he came quietly, she and the children would be safe. She saw him several times in jail thereafter, but then fighting broke out and she lost contact, and she never heard from him again until several weeks after the incident. And this is several weeks where she wrote to Trujillo on the front lines, and he said some very concerning things about things being out of his control. And she begged and pleaded with all of their former friends in the party for news. One night, a soldier came to the door and handed her a sheet of paper. It had a poem in writing that she recognized, and it was his farewell love poem to her. And that was the story that she told me as the introduction to my family history when I was 22. Anyway, I will stop talking there. I really would really rather just have a conversation and both hear your reactions and find out what you're curious about and what resonates with you.
Mai, thank you so much. That was just like beautiful and captivating. If you have a question for Mai or an experience or something that you want to share, please feel free to you can use it in the reactions. You can raise your hand that way. You can put it in the chat. You can do your best to wave your hands like this and try to get my attention. And I will try to help and keep things in order, call on people. But I've got two screens here. We've got too many people for one screen. So if I don't see you, try the reactions with the raise hand, because that pops you up to the top of the screen. I might start with if you don't mind, I'll start with a question. I was really struck by, gosh, so much, but I was wondering, in your experience now as an adult, I don't know how many other sort of refugee families that you've encountered and you know, kind of shared experiences with, but I'm curious if it was typical of families not to talk about what was happening as it was going on, and if that was, you know, somehow considered better for the kids not to know, or that sort of thing. It's just it's really striking as part of your story.
Yeah, so what I can speak to is my own experience in my extended family, and the little bits and snippets that I heard. So here's what I would say. In my family, not many kids asked. I was very unusual in asking and in wanting the history. And I think that that really stressed my parents out. It is also true that I had college classmates, and we met other young expats in Vietnam when we were there, whose parents were very open with them about what happened, and that was driven by their parents, not necessarily by them asking. So, you know, it's just it's such a complicated interaction of their own trauma. Both my parents lost their fathers at young ages. How they processed that, the fact that even though my father had a master's degree in child psychology, he sometimes forgot it. Right. In the parenting that he did. He would then remember, and he, you know, but his constraint was always his own trauma, I think. Which is why, you know, in the last chapter, I talk about how trauma bleeds. It seeps from one generation to the next.
There's a question actually that I in the chat, which is kind of relevant. How have your children adjusted to the different cultures?
Oh, my children, I believe that I have spoiled them with too happy a childhood. They feel no ambivalence or ambiguity whatsoever. They are who they are. When we ask them to rank their various identities, because, you know, obviously their dad is Jewish and gringo, they will usually lead with American, Vietnamese, white, you know, the baby might say maybe Jewish. Yeah, they don't have any problems with it at all. I think especially because they're growing up in a generation, their generation is so much more exposed to mixed race peers and multicultural settings. And my older one, Benjamin in particular, he can play anybody on TV in the right light. He can look Latino or Israeli or Vietnamese or whatever you like. And so for him, existence is just extremely fluid. And he doesn't have the trauma to layer on top of these things. And so it's just a much more straightforward navigation for him, I think.
There's another question in the chat. I hope you feel better now, question mark.
Oh, is that about me? Yes. So I didn't get a chance to read you some of the racier parts of the memoir that have to do with, you know, that long therapeutic journey back to normal. So what I discovered after my as a consequence of my breakdown in midlife or in my 30s was that if you've heard of dissociative identity disorder, it used to be called multiple personality. I was never quite there, but I was way closer to that end than I was to normal. That once I understood what was happening in my head, I discovered other characters besides Michael, lots of little girls. And And those little girls had things to teach me. And one in particular, the 8-year-old, was severely traumatized. In fact, I found her in my head on the railroad walk bridge that I would cross every day going to school, burned to a crisp. Like, the way I describe it is, she looked like how Mai Pham girl would have looked in that famous war photo had she stopped running. And I had to decide psychologically whether I was willing to revive her. And that took some time. That took a great deal of work to convince myself that I should revive her and hear what she had to say. So the short answer is yes. I am now at a stage in life where I can honestly say that I have never felt so actualized ever, personally, professionally. And that's wonderful, because we should all have that experience, that every subsequent decade of life is better than the last. But it was a long road. How have you experienced racism in the US? Yeah. I'll take the second question. I don't have an agent, and yes, I would love an introduction. You know, racism directed at me personally was very sporadic, and I would say not, very sporadic when it was overt. When it was covert, it was more frequent, but it was hard for me to tease out, okay, how much of that is racism? How much of it is short, loud female? How much of it, it was hard to tease that out. But I will tell you that I grew up in majority Black Philadelphia public schools. And when I went to Harvard and Boston and Cambridge for college, I realized how I had grown up in majority Black Philadelphia public schools, because I experienced Boston as the single most racist place I have ever lived. And it was because I felt Black in Cambridge. And I had taken for granted how much color was normal in my life. It took going to Massachusetts to see that that was not normal for a lot of America. And so I walk around with this weird mix of, on the one hand, absorbing anti-Asian sentiment from Black Americans, because I feel like, relative to them, I'm privileged and I can absorb it. I'm okay. And I vacillate between that and like just rage on behalf of Black Americans, just like white rage. Sorry to mix the metaphors there, because I lived it. I'm grateful to learn new statistics and new sociology all the time about structural racism, but I lived it, and it was very visceral. I was a senior in college in Harvard when, I don't know if you remember, but that year in 1990, Charles Stewart was a white man who called the police to say that his pregnant wife had been shot and killed by a young Black man as they were sitting in their parked car. And a manhunt ensued, and Black men were lined up for blocks in Boston. And a week or two later, his brother called the police to tell them that he suspected Charles had shot his own wife, and Charles Stewart committed suicide. And then there were all these op-eds, right? Newspaper op-eds, and let's understand what happened. And I was just paralyzed with rage, because I thought, if this was Philly, we turn a bus over and set it on fire, and then we can talk, right? So that I have this really weird push and pull with racism.
Well, does anybody, like I said, I can't see everybody. Mai, I wonder if you can talk about your, oh, Dawn wants to know,
Back to
are
you.
you,
Yes,
yeah,
we finally took both boys back. Gosh, maybe 7 years ago, and it was wonderful. It wasn't as deep or resonant a trip for them as it was for me, obviously, and maybe I was a little disappointed that way. Um, because they were teenagers, and but something did take hold. So, my younger one, for him, that's still one of his favorite trips ever, partly because we got to go climbing on an eco tour, climbing through the rainforest and then spelunking in caves, and swimming for 100 yards with our clothes and our backpacks on and eating gnats. and but the older one actually went back on his own during his gap year. Um, and it doesn't feel the same to me as it did in 1998 and 99. Saigon has just exploded in terms of size and complexity and money, and it doesn't have, I still have auditory memories of the echoing down the alleys, and it's hard to get that now. There are too many cars. So it doesn't feel quite the same, but I'm glad that my kids feel some ownership of it.
I wonder if you,
I'd love to hear more about the memoir group also. And
well, I do think that a special visit to the memoir group would probably be in order. But can you talk more about your experience as an artist? And because you have so many different media that you work in, clearly, I mean, writing being one, painting, sculpture, food.
yeah, I'm a classic Gemini, and I think I would describe myself as reliably B plus A minus in whatever medium. But I don't have the discipline to, I don't think, be as refined an artisan as true experts. But my art began as just an outlet. I have one of my older brothers is truly talented, and he's a classical artist. He's experimenting with some new media now, but he's a realist, and you would recognize his style as being very classical and French, and lots of line drawings, lots of live sculptures, and huge murals in his own home. I am not a great draftsman, and I'm colorblind, and I'm underconfident. So I tend to veer toward things that are very vivid because those are the colors that I can see. Muddy colors vibrate to my eyes. I tend to do large shapes with lots of large movements because then I don't have to be a great draftsman. But I also love to experiment with multimedia. So one of my favorite paintings is one that Alexander and I did, where if I have time, I'll pull it up for you. We glazed on probably a couple thousand pieces of wood shavings to form circles that look like tree crosscuts, because that's how I like my irony served up. And so, I go through phases. There was a large canvas phase, there was a metal jewelry phase, there was a paper sculpture phase in 3D frame boxes. And most recently, I learned welding. And, there are artists who bend materials to their will. And I am not one of those. Usually the material wins. But what I learned is that when the pixels are small enough, so this is the paradox, unlike my painting where I have big movements, with welding, I prefer really little pixels. So I weld washers of different kinds, and I follow them. Usually I have some vague concept in mind, but they win at the end of the day. Um, and so that's, I've learned that one of their qualities is they're hard, but they're porous. And so you can set up these, you can build these pieces that are that combination of transparent, but also very solid. And you can convey in that things like relationships and dream states and what home means. And I've learned to also like putting LED lights on the inside, clusters of LED lights on the inside. So then you see all the shadows of the washer circles on the walls and ceiling. So that's where I am. And baking is a phase. I will not ever apply to Great British Bake Off. Just
I did it just, yeah.
Under pressure.
I saw Carolyn, or the other, another artist among us, nodding along as you were talking about your different phases and things like that. I think it was resonating. There's one more question in the chat, Mai, and then I think we're going to have to call it a night. Let you answer this one. So, and then we'll talk about the memoir group and connect you with Karen, who offered her agent and all that kind of good stuff.
So, I ache for the country, and I will tell you that one of the darkest days for me was on January 6th when I saw a protester waving the South Vietnamese flag in the melee. And what made it dark for me was not just that I didn't want my kind represented on that scene, but because the learning of my entire journey is that this is how high a price immigrants are willing to pay for a chance at a better life, and especially a better life in America. And I would pay that price over and over and over again. And so the sight of that flag on that day in that setting just made me ill. Because I thought about all of what his family paid for him to be here, and that the depth of that disrespect, which I don't know how much you know about Vietnamese culture, but regardless of what religion you are, Buddhist, Catholic, whatever, everyone practices ancestor worship. I have an ancestor worship table that I welded, and its legs are made of curved metal that spell out the names of my husband's two family last names and my family's two last names. And then across the top of the table are the names of our respective ancestral homelands. And in two panes of glass float the pictures of our dead ancestors. So I thought about that flag, and I thought about that disrespect, and I thought, how could he ever go back home to his banta, to his altar table? Because when I stand there, I feel a sense of accountability. And this whole book is my offering at the altar table. That is how much America means to me.
Well, Mai, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of the village and our members for sharing from your story today. I think you've piqued a lot of interest, and I know that people are going to be clamoring to have you come to the memoir group and to other things, and to continue to learn from you. Thank you for your vulnerability and for sharing. And if folks want to take themselves off mute and offer their own thanks and applause, I think that would be most welcome.
Thank you so much. This was, I wasn't sure how this would go. And you're actually my first, my first audience to talk about this. It wasn't some girlfriend I made read the book. So I so appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Really do appreciate you. All right,
Thanks for your wonderful, it was really on a depiction of what you've gone through. I really loved it.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
well, thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
And come back for another Village Voices sometime
Absolutely.
soon. And,
Absolutely. We'll be back.
Okay,
This was
well,
fabulous.
good.
Thank you.
Karen, I have your email and I have Mai's email, and so I will put the two of you in touch.
Great, great.
Um,
Thank you. I look forward to
I've
it.
got that, Judy.
You've got it taken care of. Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
all right. Well, good.
Take
What a
care.
wonderful
Everyone have
thing!
a
What a
great
wonderful thing if publication came out of this experience. So
Right.
we'd all feel proud
Yeah.
to have been part of it.
Be a long acknowledgements list. Take care.
Well, I think folks would probably stay and talk with you as long as you're able and willing. But if it's time to go, did we go?